Hi, thank you everyone for joining us today. For those of you that I haven't met before, my name's Charlie. I am the Postdoctoral Studies Coordinator in YSGS at TMU. So a quick overview of the structure of our event today. We're going to have our panelists talk each in turn, and they will share their experience of moving from academia into a different industry role. They'll share some general advice and tips. And then following that, we will move to a Q&A session. So while the panelists are talking, if you have any questions, just drop them into the chat box and we will come to them at the end after everyone has finished talking. So just a reminder, while the panelists are speaking, if you could keep your microphones switched off. And if you want, you can also hide your camera just to avoid distraction. So I think that's all of the, also the session is going to be recorded as it says on the screen. I think that's everything. I'll pass over to Dr. Carl Camaradas, who is our chair for the event.
Thanks, Charlie. So yeah, I'm Carl Camaradas. I'm the Associate Dean for Programs at the Yeates School of Graduate Studies. So thank you all for being here, and thank you to the panelists for joining us today. Before we get going, I just wanted to acknowledge the land we all live on. Toronto, or Toronto as it's traditionally known, occupies a place that has become home to Indigenous peoples for over 15,000 years. They are the Huron-Wendat, Petun First Nations, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the New Credit River. This territory is subject to the Dish with One Spoon, Wampun Treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and the Haudenosaunee that bound them to share and protect this land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples and settlers from all over the globe have been welcomed into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. Toronto is now home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. Recognizing where we stand is not to historicize the experiences of Indigenous people or to offer platitudes. It is but one of many intentional acts for acknowledging injustices and committing ourselves to individually and collectively as a university to the path of truth and reconciliation. So as Charlie mentioned, I will introduce the panelists. Unfortunately, one of our panelists, Richard McCullough, is sick and unable to join us today. It was a sudden illness that came up yesterday. So we have the three other panelists with us who are great. And so I think we still have a lot of good advice and discussions forthcoming. So I will go through and introduce each of the panelists, and after I introduce each panelist, I'll ask them to spend a bit of time describing their path and giving us any general advice they have. And then we'll get into the question and answer period. We do have some questions that were submitted in advance, and there were a lot of questions submitted in advance, and we sort of took them and collectively came up with 3 or 4 general questions that we think cover a large number of the specific questions. And there were others that didn't fit the general themes, which we will get to next after that. But we'll also look for questions in the chat as the panelists speak. So first, sorry, before that, I did want to introduce May Haithem, who's a career educational specialist at the Yeates School of Graduate Studies. And May wanted to just give you a few, point you to a few resources before we get to the panelists. So May, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Carl. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. So I'm going to share a few links in the chat. Hopefully you can copy them. If not, it's okay. Charlie will be sending a follow-up email with all those links. So those resources are available to you as postdoc fellows. So you can check out our Graduate Career Compass, which is a document that you can download. And it has a lot of really great information. Near the end of the document, you'll see sample resumes, CVs, cover letters that you can check out. You also have access to our one-on-one appointments where you can meet with me or our career education specialist to discuss anything that is related to your career. So it could be, again, your resume, your CV, we could take a look at that, your LinkedIn, networking strategies, interviewing tips, or even career advising if you're not sure where to start. And finally, we have workshops that run throughout the year to help you connect with, just like this event, panelists from different industries, as well as connect and network with employers from the industry and from academia as well. So check those links out when you get a chance. Again, if you don't have access to them right now, Charlie will be sending those links to you in an email as a follow-up. Thank you so much. Over to you, Carl.
Thank you, May. So our first panelist is Jennifer Polk, or Jen, as she likes to be called. Jen is a career coach for graduates and PhDs. She regularly facilitates professional development workshops and delivers presentations for students and postdocs. Her University Affairs blog was a 3-time gold winner from the Canadian Online Publishing Awards. Jen's essays have also appeared in Inside Higher Ed, the Chronicle of Higher Education, the Globe and Mail, Academic Matters, as well as in 3 books. More recently, she was an expert panelist for the 2021 Canadian Association of Academies report, Degrees of Success on the Challenges of PhDs Facing Transition to Employment. In addition, Jen currently serves on the board of directors for CAGS, which is the Canadian Association for Graduate Studies. She earned a PhD in history from the University of Toronto. So over to you, Jen.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you very much. Let me open my slide deck here. Hold on, do this again. Screen share. There we go. Cool. So you should see my old headshot from a few years back. Thank you all for being here. I really enjoyed doing these panels. So as Carl mentioned, yeah, you can call me Jen. I got my PhD a decade ago, and I live here in Toronto. I have done for many years now. And this is my website, FromPhDtoLife.com. So let me start my few minutes discussion by reflecting on where I was 10 years ago. So I'd finished my PhD and I didn't have anything meaningful lined up in terms of a job. So what do? I thought a lot about how the only thing I'm good for is being a professor, but I can't be a professor. So now what? So that like a couple of sentences sums up a lot of the thoughts that I had going through my head. I'm not saying that this was the correct thoughts in terms of actual factual reality, but there were definitely thoughts and feelings that I had back then. I had a few other ideas that I wasn't sure of. So in my case, a history PhD. So, okay, what about museums, archives, government departments, maybe cultural and arts nonprofits, writing and editing, freelancing, publishing houses, question mark, right? So that's what I was sort of thinking about. As it turned out, none of those really seemed viable to me. And the more I learned about them, I wasn't so thrilled either. I was freelancing to tide me over, but that didn't seem to be going anywhere either. So far, right? Like thumbs down. I was stuck in what I now call the endless cycle of nope. So frustration, resignation, even despair, right? Nothing seemed appealing. I didn't think anybody would hire me. Leaving academia felt like a sellout over and over again. A client of mine recently called this the depths. Yeah, I was in the depths. I did eventually figure it out. And by now, skip ahead a few years, I help other PhDs confidently apply for jobs they'll love, even if they don't know what career path to choose. So May works for your university. In my case, I'm self-employed and my business is called FromPhDtoLife. And there's my nice new logo. I like it anyways. Over the years that I started working as a career coach for PhDs back in 2013, well, by now I've had hundreds of clients and delivered dozens of workshops at universities and academic conferences. And I've also produced other educational programming and built career resources for PhDs and universities. And I'm involved in broader work in this field, including research about this. And Carl mentioned a couple of those things. So here's the front of Degrees of Success, that government report on the challenges PhD graduates face when they transition to the labor market. And yeah, Carl also mentioned I'm a board member of CAGS. To bring you up to date on my business in one slide, last year, I took everything that I've learned and developed the PhD Career Clarity System. It's a holistic step-by-step framework, right, marketing voice, for PhDs who don't know what they want to do or how to get there. I have a lot to say about all of this, right? So be happy to answer any questions you've got over the next few minutes. But right now, let me keep it to 3 pieces of advice. I don't want to take too much time. So first piece of advice, attend to your thoughts and emotions, including the stories that you're telling yourself about yourself and the world of work, right? So pay attention to those stories, thoughts, and emotions. Second, self-reflection is critical. Do not skip this step. You probably need to do even more of it. And third, reframe networking as learning, sharing, and community building, and it will never feel gross. Okay, see, that's a reframe, different story. Finally, shameless self-promotion. I do have a free job search training on my website, and you can access that at this link. Let me put that in the chat for everybody. And yeah, thanks. I'm glad to be here. I will stop my share. That's great. Done.
Thanks, Jen. Next up is Peter. Peter Bevin. So Peter Bevin is I'm sorry, give me a second. A senior manager at digital health at KPMG. Peter completed his PhD in medical biophysics at the University of Toronto, followed by a postdoctoral fellowship and assistant professorship in the Department of Biomedical Engineering at McMaster University. Peter left academia to support digital healthcare systems transformation with KPMG as a senior manager. And I do want to say that Peter and I were fellow grad students a long time ago, so it's nice to see Peter again. It's been a while. Over to you, Peter.
To say it's been a while might be an understatement, Carl. I think so. It was, who said 2001 is when I got my master's degree, and that was the tail end of the first 2.5 years since we first met as I entered academia. So in my journey has been a bit of a winding path. I actually started out with a bachelor's degree in physics, of all things, and I did that because I thought it was going to be the easy path for me. My parents were doctors. I wanted to avoid healthcare at all costs. I thought their job was way too hard, so I was foolish enough to think that physics was the easy way to go. I didn't know what I was going to do at the end of my PhD. There's a theme here, by the way. Didn't know what I was going to do at the end of my bachelor's degree. I stumbled into a summer research project, which then led me to some great advice from the mentors I had there of some potential grad schools. All I knew at that point was I really enjoyed research. I really enjoyed solving problems. I really enjoyed working with smart people to do smart things that might actually have a chance of having some impact. And I ended up at U of T, where I met Carl in that first lab and did my master's, my PhD, and my first postdoc at U of T, all in medical biophysics. By the end of that, I realized that the academic path probably wasn't the right one for me. The assumption that I was going to bounce around between labs, even between those degrees, and then for multiple postdocs, and then eventually stumble into a lab of my own was certainly not the journey I was on. I was fortunate enough to trip into hearing about the Mitacs Elevate Fellowship. It was a new program at the time. I was in the first cohort of this industry match fellowship, and this really piqued my interest. It was a way to not throw the baby out with the bathwater, as I considered my transition from academia, to really use the skills I had to do something completely new and to just redirect away from where I knew I didn't belong into an area where I might. I ended up working in multimodal image fusion for a few years and then really dive deep into medical device development and medical robotics. I was fortunate enough that that role linked me up with some brilliant engineers at MDA Robotics, the formerly Spar Aerospace that created the original Canada arm and bits of the Mars rover. And as a consequence, I actually got to stick my head inside the original Canada arm because it was being decommissioned at the time that I was working with them, and it was sitting 10 feet away from me all day long, every day, while we were testing our robotics that we were developing. I linked up with business for the first time and what it meant to think not just about funding for an academic lab, but also funding for a broader initiative and value in a bigger sense outside, and a financial sense outside that academic currency that I was used to. I was the hub between academics, clinicians, business partners, regulatory space, and engineering partners for that initiative. And fortuitously, as I closed that out and moved from transitioning from benchtop prototype to Health Canada approved trials, I was lucky enough to actually take on a mat leave replacement for somebody else I'd been to grad school with. She was having her second kid, and I got to be the interim manager for the cancer imaging program at Cancer Care Ontario for a year. At the end of that, turned to my director and I said, what do you think I should do? And he said, have you ever considered consulting, reflecting back on how I tackled that job, not just as something where I kept the lights on acting as a temp, but actually drove thinking about what was the strategic direction for what they needed and would I help them align to a future vision for what they wanted to achieve. And I said, honestly, Saul, no, I have no idea what consulting is. So I started talking to folks. I met some friends and eventually met a partner, had coffee for an hour and a half. And a month later, I found myself in Albany on a 2-year-long healthcare transformation across the state that involved 150 consultants. And me getting to work with folks all the way from health providers on the ground in the hospitals, building new integrated health systems, to spending the last year and a half working directly with the program director and the Medicaid director of the state. Since then, I've been lucky enough to work across the country on business cases and on implementations for health information systems, supported the development of the parts of the business case for an electronic health record in Ireland, and worked in Eastern Ontario to envision, design, and lift up central intake for diagnostic imaging services across the region. I came full circle and ended up doing some work with the space agency as well on digital health and what digital health looks like on Mars. And I spent the last 2 years working with the federal government to help drive COVID response related to border measures, travel, and some of the internal measures of the government. So this journey is one that I never could have planned along the way, but it makes perfect sense to me when I look back at it. At the end, people ask me things like, should I do a PhD, a postdoc, a master's degree, or some upgrade in my credentials? My answer is yes, if you want to, and if it's valuable to you first. Because the second piece of advice is that I learned very quickly in my PhD, in the consulting world, that my PhD wasn't an asset until I proved myself to be one first. And now, 7.5 years in, people don't mind the fact that I've got those 3 letters after my name, though it rarely comes up. And occasionally just helps get my foot in the door. And I'll also say that in my practice, I was probably part of the first wave of what is now actually surprisingly common, and that's that there is no common profile for the consultant anymore, at least in what we do. So not only are we seeing lots of different folks from different profiles coming into the work we do, we're actually actively trying to draw them in, recognizing that there's a breadth of what we need to take forward. So looking forward to talking to you a little bit about this very different path that I took, but one that's rewarding in exactly the same way academia always was for me. Every day, I get to solve big problems with smart people by my side and hopefully get to make an actual difference in things moving forward.
Thank you, Peter. Our last panelist is Chelsea Sutcliffe. Chelsea is a project geochemist for advanced projects at Teck Resources Limited. Chelsea moved to industry 1 year ago when she joined Teck Resources Limited, one of Canada's leading mining companies. Prior to this, most of her career was in research at the University of Toronto, where she held a postdoctoral fellow and sessional instructor and research associate positions. She earned a PhD in geochemistry from the University of Oxford. Over to you, Chelsea.
Hi, Carl. Thank you. I prepared some slides. Thanks, Charlie. And the title here is a non-academic pathway of a very academic person, because I think I can echo Peter's sentiments there that this was a winding road. And although, there's a stigma against spending so much time in research, and, you should really just spend 2 years, otherwise you're useless to industry as a postdoc. I don't find that to be true. And I really value all of the years that I spent in the different research positions that I held, as well as all the lessons that I learned from them and all of those different experiences. But I did spend a total of 12 years in research. So that's 4 years for my PhD plus 3 different research appointments, which totaled 8 years. So quite a while. So next slide, please. This is just to show you a brief timeline. And a nice illustration here that I started out as a geologist, but that's a very physical science, and I loved being out in the field. I then slowly wound my way, really by choice. I followed the science and I loved cosmochemistry, so I ended up doing a lot of lab work. I then, during my postdocs, focused more on terrestrial habitats, so I actually also did some work with the CSA, the Canadian Space Agency too, Peter. And then I just found I was in the lab a lot, and then increasingly more so. I wasn't in the field anymore, and suddenly I was really, really good at getting very particular sets of data and became very well known for that. And whilst that's great, it wasn't particularly what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. And then I found myself in that classic research conundrum of being pigeonholed by your speciality. So I had to work very, very hard to find other avenues. And that's just because, as great as it is to be so specialized in something, it can also be a downfall. You can be known specifically for that one thing, and it's tough to sometimes transition out of it. So the next slide, please. So I would say that I spent about 3 years really focusing on my transition. And I'm going into some detail here for any of the attendees who might be in this journey and might be thinking about it, just so that you feel validated in how gruesome it can be sometimes, and that it can take some time to affect that change. So it was in 2018 that I started really applying for non-academic jobs and seeing what was out there, things like journal editors and the like. In 2019, I realized that I had to spend a bit more time doing this after I was one of the final 2 candidates for a job that I assumed probably I was a shoo-in for because I had been doing some postdoc work with this NGO. Then I got to the interview process and realized that I did not know how to interview well at all. I could talk very clearly on scientific subjects, but when it came to really pinpointing down skills and transferable skills and how that adds value, I know that's a buzzword, I was not that great at it. So I spent the majority of the next year, 2019 to 2020, really focusing internally on how I was going to do that. Now, for a scientist like me, a lot of that is learning how to talk about yourself, which is excruciating. And unfortunately, you're going to have to do it. And this is a skill that isn't just a hard skill. Like, you shouldn't be ashamed of it. We should all learn how to talk about ourselves and the work that we do, because at the end of the day, you could write an amazing paper, but if you can't communicate that value, what's the point of doing it, right? So it's both within the scientific field and outside of the scientific field that this is important. So it was during this point that I really started kind of realizing that I had to promote myself in different ways. So that, as simple as it is, it's networking, creating a LinkedIn profile. I hired a career coach that was incredible, really opened up my eyes. I joined the Cheeky Scientists Association, if you haven't heard of that. It's a big group of scientists. As to whether I would recommend it, that's a different topic, and you can ask me more if you wish to in the Q&A session. But I would say that in the thick of it, as well as balancing my life in academia, and I'm like still publishing papers, it was gruesome because it's time consuming. You're going to spend a few hours a day applying, preparing, interviewing. You have to work hard at it. It is a full-time job sometimes to get that full-time job. But at the end of the day, the networks and the people that you meet, they are the most important. And that's what I found in my journey. For every single job that I made it to the end and I was truly a fit for that position, I had been referred internally by somebody that I knew at that company. And often that means that there's that Venn diagram of experience. And that's sometimes at the end of the day, that's all it means, is that the right opportunity will come along at the right time. So next slide, please. Oh, and just a note at the end there, there were times that I was hitting those depths, as Jen said, and I didn't think that I would ever get there. But at the end of the day, when I did have to make my decision, I had 2 job offers, which were both incredible, and I was choosing between those. So you can do it too, I promise. So why was I hired? Of course, having a PhD is great, but like Peter said, it can be a foot in the door, but it's not everything. The main reason really was a transferable skill. So that's conducting your own independent research, being able to learn by yourself. No manager wants to hire a person and then have to spend 8 hours a day teaching them how to do something. Applying scientific principles is important in every aspect of a job, I find. I'm fluent in Spanish. That was a plus, obviously, for a mining company that operates down in South America. But I also had very specialized knowledge as a subject matter expert. And that was accumulated through those 8 years of postdocs where I was just meandering my way through life and really just following the science of what I loved. And now in the position that I'm in, I've been promoted to a global lead, which is terrifying for that subject matter expert, but that's the way it goes. Your skills are in demand. You will never really be able to predict how they will be applied or in what position, but believe me, they are there. I also lectured throughout my entire time at U of T. Everybody else thought I was crazy because that's essentially a prof job, but I was also earning my own money doing research on the side. But I loved teaching, and that's a really important skill and one that you can curate at whatever postdoc or PhD level you're at. There's some really valuable soft skills to be learned there, like learning how to communicate things to people from every level is very, very important. And if you do have ambitions to be a manager or a technical lead, and I was hired with that vision that I will eventually be a technical leader in my field, then that is very valuable skills to have. And then obviously what I lacked was 4 to 8 years of knowledge in the field and all of the industry experience that I now have to spend catching up on, which you can do because when you're a postdoc, you learn how to learn things very, very fast. And next slide, please. Okay, so general advice. I mean, you're going to hear it. You're going to hear it from us all. Things that you may have heard before is, you know, spending a good amount of time curating your CV, your resume, cutting out the academic resume that is not going to serve you anymore, joining professional networks, and a big thing, honestly, is support from your colleagues, mentors, your friends. Talk about the transition, be open about it, and do your research. It is very taxing to apply for a job, get excited, go through the interview process, but if you do not spend the appropriate amount of time doing your research about the company, about the position, and being able to talk the talk, then you're not going to be considered. Networking, obviously, attending industry conferences. I wish I had started that sooner. Even if I was going to stay in academia, your scientific research should be relevant, and that's the best way to find out its relevance. Joining professional organizations or career coaching like Jen does, and building and maintaining your relationships. We're all humans at the end of the day. Don't see it as some sleek thing you have to do to be valuable. Just treat everybody as a human and develop those and respect those friendships and colleague relationships. And then the last thing I'll say is that opportunity is luck. It can take a very long time for that right opportunity to come up. Be as prepared as you possibly can for when that arrives, but be very kind to yourself in the interim. There were definitely times that I was not kind to myself, and I wish I had been kinder. And you should lean on your personal network as well as your professional during that time. And that's it for me. Thanks.
Thanks, Chelsea. So we'll move on to the questions. And as I said, we've sort of asked the panelists to respond to 3 general questions that I'll read out in a moment. There is also a question that came to me in the chat that I'll try to bring up, and then we have some other questions that were sent in advance that we'll also get to. So and I think a lot of you have already touched on this, but maybe if you want to expand or be more specific. So the first question is, how do we find roles outside academia, or where should we look? And again, I'll open it up to panelists, and any one of the 3 of you can just unmute and start speaking. If you both speak simultaneously, you'll figure it out together. So go ahead.
I'm smiling because I'm muscling in here. This is often the first question that folks ask: where do I find job postings? And no. So you're in very good company asking this question, but it's the wrong first question. The question that I asked back to you is, well, what do you want to do? Because where you find opportunities, where you look for jobs, super depends on where you want to go. And if you don't already know the answer to that, forget about job postings. That is not what you need to be doing right now. You need to be doing the self-reflection and the research to figure out where you want to go. I will say also, even when you get to the point of I spoke to a physics PhD earlier, currently a postdoc, who knows very exactly that he wants to go into data science next. Even at that point, you don't just want to be looking at job boards. You don't just want to be super focused on the job section of LinkedIn or Indeed or Glassdoor or whatever it is. You've got to be networking with folks. You've got to be doing that research. So my answer to your question is no, stop that, go back a few steps. Does that make sense, folks? I'm not a jerk, I promise, a little bit.
Thanks, Jen.
I think I could.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say I couldn't agree more with that. I think it's really important to be, thinking about what it is you're going to do. My lesson in this came as a graduate student. I kept wanting to do something a little bit different. I kept getting disheartened with the path I was on, because just like the vast majority of graduate student problems, things were negative. Things were negative results. Things weren't working out. And I wanted to go on to something that was getting a better and better idea that would. And then when I tried to be an academic and I tried to get funding, I tried to do the same thing. And I just tried to jump too far too fast. I was asking people to let me do things that they had no confidence that I could do, and it had nothing to do with my training, it had nothing to do with my smarts, it had nothing to do with, the skills and capabilities I had. It had to do with my credentials. It had to do with the qualifications that I had behind me that gave them confidence in that. So I started asking myself, well, what will people let me do? Where can I go? What's the path that I'm on? And as I started to find that path, I then looked for what's my guiding star way ahead of this. So when I was working at CCO, I remember specifically thinking, oh, I know the guy who's the boss at this place. Maybe that's something for me to shoot for. I mean, it was actually Carlson, my graduate supervisor, was the guy who was the boss of the place at the time. And I remember thinking, even if that's not the job I want, maybe if I just imagined for myself that's my target and the path I want to be on, what should my very next step be? And that really narrowed it down where I started to look, and it really narrowed down the way that I thought about where that was. So that was my tactical approach to achieving, Jennifer, your recommendation there of not just blanketing everybody and keeping your fingers crossed.
Yeah, that's great advice. And I also echo very much the same. I'll also add maybe on top of that, and very closely related to it, that if you really hone in on your path and the skills that you have to offer and where they fit into our society today, you'll find that there are jobs that may not exist right now that you can fill and that you can create. And these companies often are looking for that. It's very difficult for them to post a job and attract the kind of talent that you might be able to offer them. So it really is about networking and finding out those very specific niches that you can fit very well into. And that's probably the only thing I'll add here.
Thanks, Chelsea. The next question is kind of related to this, and also there was a question that was sent in the chat directly to me that's related. Maybe I'll bring that up, and that is sort of networking seems to be an important element of finding a career outside of academia. So the question is how do you go about networking, of finding people to network, and how do you network? So and I know Jen talked nicely about reframing it, and so maybe Jen, you want to speak a bit more about that, and then I'll let you speak.
Yeah, thanks. Of course, I don't always have to go first. Networking, right? Yeah. So often people think that networking is just about who you know, and those folks then hiring you outright, and that does sometimes happen. And it's just because people are humans, right? Like, it doesn't have to be nepotism or anything weird. It's just, people trust who they already know. And if that's you and you're the right fit, easy, done, right? It just makes it so much faster and quicker for a hiring manager to just hire you. Networking is super important because, yeah, that might happen, and that's cool. There might be a situation where you could be referred by an internal employee, and they get a big check afterwards and you get hired faster, like that can happen. That's cool. But networking, if you think broadly, is so important because you don't want to have a shitty next job. I mean, I'm assuming, right? You want to have a job that really suits you where you are now and where you want to go next. And the best way to learn about this stuff is doing research and speaking directly with the folks who are in those jobs now, who have been in those jobs previously, who know that industry in general, who hire for those jobs, etc. Go direct to the people. This is research. It's qualitative research, to use that term. You will know much more for yourself, but also in a practical sense, you will be able to write better application materials. You will be better able to market yourself on sites like LinkedIn, in your cover letter, etc. Because you will just by being in conversation with these folks, you will know what concerns them, what problems they have, what are the trends in the industry. You can't do that just by, trolling the internet. You can do some of that. I would also say that networking, and this is the last thing I'll say about this, is it's not only just the one-on-one with somebody over coffee. It can be Zoom, it can be phone, it can be email exchanges, it can be, back channels in the Zoom chat, right, during a panel. It can be LinkedIn messaging. It can be posting, commenting on LinkedIn posts. Like it can be Twitter, so think about networking in a really super broad way and I lied, one more thing. Also think of it as building your community, right? The people that you want to hang out with. And if you discover you don't want to hang out with any of these people, well, that's okay. You can pivot.
Thanks, Jen. Chelsea or Peter, anything to add to that?
Again, great advice. I wish I had Jen just constantly talking to me every day when I was going through this. Yeah, I mean, one thing I'll say is, let's face the facts. We're probably all quite nerdy about what we do here. We wouldn't be doing it if we weren't. So don't see networking as this kind of blunt skill you have to do. Like, just enjoy it. Speak about what you love. Post about that. A sad thing is sometimes LinkedIn to me is now social media because I just love reading everybody's posts. I just love reading about the fringes of what I work on. And it's a great source to do that. And it doesn't have to be LinkedIn. It can be anything, but just promote what you love and don't feel it's promoting. Just chat about it. And that's the way I see networking. It's just everybody having a license to be nerdy, which is just fantastic for me.
I think building on that a little bit, I mean, it is just chatting with folks. And, as a consultant in what I do, it's kind of what I do all day, every day without thinking about it. And I am not an extroverted person, despite, the fact that I can act it pretty well sometimes in front of the client or in front of others. It's like, for me, if I'm I would say that I'm networking with my team when I'm talking with them and I'm trying to encourage them to work better. I would say that if I look back, I was networking as a grad student mentor or an undergraduate prof. That was kind of networking. I was trying to get people to engage with me and I wanted them to. I didn't want to just stand there and be a mouthpiece. So you're probably already doing a bunch of the things that you might put under the umbrella of networking, but you're just not calling it that yet. I'd also say that the same advice I give the folks that I work with, and especially the people who are more junior on my team and who are looking to figure out what does it mean when our senior leadership says to network with our clients and get to know them and look for what they need. And I share with them that networking is easy when you're doing it with the right people at the right level in the right context. It's just having these chats. It's not trying as a junior analyst to go and be best friends with the CEO. It's about talking to the people who you're working alongside, finding what they're facing every day and getting the introductions there. If you're talking about a job fair, it's not about going to the CFO and hoping that they'll hire you to do something for them. It's about going to people who work for the CFO or work for the VPs or work 4 levels down from them who you'd be working alongside every day, so that they go to their manager or their director and they say, you know what? I met this great person who I'd actually love to be working with. So that's where you should think about networking. Much safer, much lower profile, and much more exciting and fun, where you kind of get to just be a nerd with other nerds like you.
Thanks, Peter. I think as Peter was speaking, it just reminded me a bit of when I was a grad student and networking. So, you know, in the position I'm in now, the path I got to here, my network helped me. But, you know, reflecting back, most of my network were actually my fellow grad students that I got to know in grad school. So don't, you know, it's easy to think of networking with a certain type of person, a person in a position of authority that can give you something, but you never know. Someone can just open a door, right, or point you in a direction that, you know what, I know this company that has a need for this type of a person, which I think you're a good match for. So, and the other thing with networking, I find, is to a good way to connect is to ask questions. You know, to ask what the other person's doing and ask about them. It's good. That's a good way to start a conversation, because a lot of people like to talk about what they do. And the last thing I'll quickly say is networking reminds me of mentoring in my role as a faculty member. And sort of this chart I put in the chat sort of highlights the different types of mentors a faculty member would need and would connect with. So sort of think broadly when you're networking. The next question is, and again, a lot of you touched on this, but I'll ask it and see what else you want to add to it. How can I predict what type of roles or areas outside of academia would allow me to thrive? So I think this is generally about sort of, are there things out there that I'll be good at that I don't know about, and how do I find out about them, right? So obviously networking is a good way to do that. But you know, besides networking, is there any other way for people to sort of find alternate career paths or options?
Waiting for me to start. I mean, this question is, what is the mathematical equation, or what is the algorithm that I can run that will spit out exactly what I should do for the rest of my life, right? I mean, that is what everybody wants, or for somebody external to them to tell them what to do, because it just, right? Like, what should I do the rest of my life? And it doesn't work like that. Like, it sucks, but it doesn't work like that. And so it really is about you figuring out. So let me put this in really, I think, simple terms. At the end of the day, or at the end of the week, sit down, walk around, whatever it is, and think to yourself, okay, what point today or this past week did I feel most energized, right? At what point this past day or week did I feel most successful? And then run through that situation. What was going on? It can be like a minute, 5 minutes, right? I'm not talking like a big thing. What was going on? What did you actually do? Were you sending emails? Were you on a panel? You know, were you learning about something, etc.? Who else was in the room? What was the context? And over time, as you kind of fill in those stories about who you are when you're at your best in the world, then, right, so you kind of fill that picture out for yourself, and like, at my best, I am someone who the skills that I most energize me are, you know, etc. Then that's kind of step one here. And then step two is you go and do that research, including by doing informational interviews. But not only that, right? Reading job ads can be really helpful here too, but don't only do that. Where can you find echoes? Where can you find manifestations of the things that energize you elsewhere, in academia, outside of academia, you know, in what companies, in what cities? I mean, where can you find echoes of that? Go and talk to those people. Am I right in assuming that this job would give me an opportunity to do X, Y, and Z? Or if you're stuck, it's like, well, I really love doing this, but I can't find it anywhere else. Is it called something different in your field? What is it called? Right? And then you sort of figure it out. You figure it out. It's like magic in a way, where you just learn what are the things that are the right next step for you. And then you apply for those jobs, you write whiz-bang cover letters, you get interviews, you do it, you get to see, was I right or not? And then you just go from there by talking to people, by learning more about yourself, by sharing what you most like, by having people say to you, like, well, why don't you apply for this job? There's no formula, but there's also a formula, right? Know yourself, know what's out there, take risks. Does that make sense?
Thanks, Jen.
I think that, I mean, building off that, there was a very practical approach that I mentioned that I took to my own career path, which was, you know, if I had a crystal ball that had told me the path I was going to be on, I wouldn't have believed it, for one. And I would have never thought I could accomplish it, for two. I think that if there were certain times when I took a very pragmatic stance of, I know what I don't want to do. I know that there are certain things I don't like about the environment I'm working in, or that I don't want to be involved in anymore. And I know that there are things that I'm probably interested in. So let's just try to redirect myself away from those things that I don't like and in the general direction of things I do, and kind of take it from there. And there was an unspoken assumption that I made in there, in that the next job I had wouldn't be the last job I had as well. And I think that's a much easier thing. I think there's much more of a culture of that now than there was even when I started in consulting or when I moved out of academia in the first place. But it was a really important realization for me that the next job I have doesn't need to be the last one. And the job I'm in right now is the one I've been in for the longest, but I don't know if it's the one I'm going to be in forever either. And so just taking a bit of a philosophy that you are always going to grow and learn and find new things. And as you go, as long as you are mindful of it, you'll start carving out that path. That's, philosophically at least, one of the most important things for me.
Thanks, Peter.
Yeah, I echo the sentiments of pay attention to what you genuinely love. I suppose an example of that is that I found myself in the lab far too much, and although I loved doing what I did, I was volunteering to teach. Of course, I was paid to do it, to teach those courses, but I had to spend a lot of time outside of my day job to do that, and clearly I loved it. And that's when I started realizing I don't think I should be a solo artist anymore. I clearly love teaching. I love being around people. I'm social. That's almost seen as a drawback, to a skill in what I was doing. But instead, I want to incorporate that into whatever I'm doing in the future. So that was very at the forefront of my mind. I was very cognizant that that was something that needed to be fulfilled. And I made an effort to redirect my career into something where I was working with teams. And now, I mean, be careful what you wish for, because I probably have about 5 hours of calls with different teams a day. But I love it. You know, it energizes me. It fulfills me. I absolutely love it. And probably a second piece of advice is take the time to do your research, not only in the career, but on the company, because that can also have a huge impact on what it is that you're doing day to day. For example, I am very fortunate, the company that I work for now, there's a big focus on professional development. So even though you're hired in one role, you may end up doing something very different the next year, depending on what your strengths are and depending on what you want to do. And that is something that we should start thinking about. It's not just getting a job, it's a career. It's, you want to also be working with a company that is as focused on you as you are on them.
Thank you. The third question, and then there are a few specific questions that I think will be of interest to a lot of people in the session today. But the third question is, how do I promote myself for a role outside academia? How do I translate academic achievements into industry requirements? Should I highlight specific skills I obtained in my research project? And Chelsea, I'm just going to call on you first, maybe because this is something you've experienced, and you highlighted as a piece of advice that, you know, during your many 4 years or 6 years or 8 years after your PhD, you develop skills that were very transferable, right? So how do you show those and promote those when you're searching for positions?
Yeah, this is a tough one. Again, difficult to do when you grow up in environments or within certain fields that you're not encouraged to promote yourself or think about transferable skills. So it is very difficult coming from academia to do that, or being English and doing that. Also, you're not allowed to talk about yourself. So I would say reflection is something that Jen had brought up earlier, and you do have to spend a lot of time reflecting on what the coherent themes are in your different research appointment and unifying those, like what are those skills, and trying to translate that into just normal talk. I know CVs have a lot of jargon in them, but nobody's really going to focus too much on your CV. You're going to need to be able to talk about them in a unifying theme, and that's going to take quite a bit of reflection. So that's my advice there. For me particularly, I didn't know what I was doing when I wrote my first non-academic CV, and I did rely on help from either organizations or career coaches. And I wouldn't say that that was the final product that got me where I am, but it certainly helped change my view. And the viewpoint needs to be changed at some point. So if that's something that you think that would benefit you, then I completely encourage you to seek out those sources as even a first or hopefully even a last step, because it would be great if that was the only step that is needed. But that's my advice.
Thanks, Chelsea. Peter or Jen, anything to add?
Sure. I mean, I'm going to start out by saying that one of the ways I got that first job out of the My Tax Fellowship is because the person who hired me thought I was an engineer, not a physicist. And he didn't care whether or not I had an iron ring. He cared whether or not I could talk to and help him understand what the heck the engineers around him were talking about. And more importantly, figure out whether or not they were actually on budget when they said they were on budget, and whether they were giving him what he really wanted as the CEO. And he thought he needed an engineer to do that. So, oops, but thankfully, thankfully, he did find somebody who did have those skills and capabilities in his background, because he was able to mistake them for somebody who had an iron ring. And I think that, I mean, that speaks well to sort of my first lesson in like just really asking yourself, who's your audience? You don't have just one CV, you don't have just one cover letter. And more importantly, you don't really have a CD, you don't have a CV, you don't have one resume that somebody can read and get a snapshot of not just who you are and what you've done, but when I'm hiring, really the only question I'm asking is, do I want this person on my team? And there are lots of things that go into answering that question, but the person who can answer that best is often going to be the person who's going to have the most trouble answering it, especially coming from an area like academia, where your CV is supposed to speak for itself, and your papers are supposed to be the credentials that you bring and the currency that gets you that next job. And your humility actually is supposed to come through in person, and it's supposed to shout off the page. And it's the exact opposite when you come into a room in one of our interviews, when you're asked to actually stand up and say, not bloating, but I think that this is the right place for me to be. I understand who you are and what you're looking for, and I've got a really great idea about how I fit into your team. What do you think? That's really the conversation I'm looking to have with people who I'm hopefully going to hire.
And so what Chelsea's talking about in terms of self-reflection, what Peter's talking about in terms of knowing your audience and what they care about, that's why when you figuring out how to market yourself, you do that stuff later, after you've done what Chelsea and Peter have talked about. And once you've done those earlier steps, then you know, okay, this is what they care about. One practical piece of advice is the job ad itself. So if you're applying to an open position and not just networking your way into a job that doesn't exist yet, but if there is an open position, a job ad, and you're applying for it, think of the job ad as a checklist that the recruiter or their hiring manager is going to use when they receive all of the applications. So you want to read the job ad very carefully again and again. And every bullet point, okay, have I addressed this in my materials? Yes, no. Now, sometimes there's like 25 bullet points. That's too much for a 2-page resume and a 3/4 page CV or cover letter, excuse me. That's too much. What are the most important points? Is there any that I can kind of put together here? But have I addressed it? Yes, no. And have I used the language the recruiter or their hiring manager is going to be able to understand very clearly? I have not used academic language. Have I used their language? Right? So this kind of goes against, the fancy writing, academic stuff. Be very literal. Be very literal. They are spending a few seconds, a couple minutes, maybe if you're lucky, right? Just give them what they need, as Peter talked about, right? Give Peter what he needs so that Peter can say yes.
Thanks. So just going to move on to some of the specific questions we were sent in advance first. And this one I think is for you, Peter. What would be the career path for someone with a PhD, MBA, and 10 years of industry experience in quality improvement, change management, and healthcare at KPMG?
So I like this. When I read this question in the email you sent ahead of time, I liked reading this because there's some real familiarity with my own background, yet really and truly updated to demonstrate why I was lucky I got into my job when I did. Because yeah, a lot of folks who come in have lots of great experience in lots of different areas, and they still don't know where it's going to get them. I said in my intro that there's no longer really this expected profile of folks who come in, and there's no real, predetermined career path. But I would think that a lot of people who come in with experience come in at a level which is, not quite foot in the door. They come in as sort of a senior consultant type level, somebody who's going to really get to sink their teeth in and get their hands dirty in the work, working directly with our clients. And for me, that was on purpose, even though I'd had people management experience and project management experience, and I had my PhD and I had a couple postdocs under my belt. It was really important for me to get my hands dirty for a little while first, figuring out what the heck it meant to be working in that space. And I don't think that's just true of consulting, it's true of anywhere. Looking for that role where you really get to dig in and really get to learn what's going to take you and really accelerate your next steps. And so that then gave me the opportunity to learn what I needed to know about how the place worked so that I could then be an effective manager. And then I could keep moving through and slowly get more and more involved in bigger and bigger projects and more involved in planning what those projects were going to be. And now I'm at a point where over the last year, I've taken on a very strategic role in terms of driving how we work with healthcare in the Ottawa region. So both with hospitals and healthcare providers across the region, as well as are the federal government folks who work under the healthcare umbrella. So that means that my role has continued to grow and expand in a direction where we've done tons of great work with lots of different partners and lots of different managers. And it's my job to kind of tie that all together for people. So that's the trajectory for me, has been the trajectory for me. And that's kind of the one that everyone's on, leading bigger teams, leading bigger projects, becoming more embedded in the strategic side of what it means to run the actual business. And certainly then next steps are moving towards higher level executive director roles or even partner type roles, depending on the flavor that suits a given individual. And I'll be honest, I haven't decided which kind of path is the next one for me, though I'm sticking around as long as I can keep moving forward and doing better in my job every day, which inevitably leads to advancement in a space like the one I work in.
Thanks, Peter. And I'd say we probably don't want to look at the chat now because there's a lot of pressure on you to fix things and hire people. But Jen did mention that, and I just want to highlight that there is some real value in starting out at what, in quotes, a lower level in a new to you field. So keep that in mind. Even though you might have experience in a certain area, there's value in going to a new area and starting off at a lower level that you were hoping for, because I think that can be a good stepping stone for moving up. The next question we have is, what skills are most in demand for those considering careers outside of traditional tenure-track roles? I've heard people say things such as SQL and Python, qualitative data analysis, soft skills, etc. It would be great to get a sense of what kind of education upgrading would be worthwhile in order to become more competitive in the marketplace.
You know what I'm going to say? It depends what you want to do. People love to give advice online or, not online. You got to use SQL. You got to figure out Python. You got to learn all the latest packages for R or whatever it is. People love to tell you this. No, it depends what you want to do. I don't know how to code. It doesn't matter. But I've picked up graphic design skills, facilitation skills, copywriting skills, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Why? Because it's relevant for my chosen career path. So there's a part of this is like, what do you actually like doing? Like Chelsea was talking about realizing like, fuck, I keep choosing to teach. What is that about? Well, maybe you could upskill in those types of skills you're already developing. So that's one clue that comes from self-reflection. And then in your networking and your research, what are the skills that I'm constantly hearing about when I'm, these jobs that I want? What do I keep reading on job ads? But do not rely on that, because job ads or wish lists doesn't mean that the people they hire actually have all of those skills, right? So you definitely want to ask the question of real people. I keep seeing that I need Python. Is it true? Right? And don't just ask one person. So the most annoying academic answer is it depends, but don't listen to random advice, except mine.
I'd build on that by saying it's absolutely true that, and I get the same question all the time. And yeah, it's nice when people have some skills and some knowledge of certain things, because it can feed in even sideways into what you're doing, to have a good, keen knowledge of things. Like there's lots of knowledge and background experience I have when it comes to coding and hardware and all sorts of things, but it's the last thing I'm going to mention to anybody at my job, because it's not what I want to do every day anymore. And that was really driven home to me in the MyTex Fellowship when we had a project management training foundational course, which was a foundational course that could lead to a PMP. And that instructor was very clear in their guidance. They said, do not go get your PMP unless you want to be a project manager. Because if you get it, you will be a project manager, whether you like it or not. And sure, it would be useful if I'm grading myself against certain roles on a government CV to win some work with a federal client. Sure, it would be nice to have that PMP to get the whatever it is, 5-10 extra points. But wait long enough, like I have, and it doesn't matter anymore. Anyway, and I'm actually really glad that nobody forced me to be a really thick, in the deep weeds project manager for the last 10 years of my career.
Thanks, Peter.
Yeah, some comments from a practical perspective. What I do is pretty data science heavy, I would say, and it kind of always has been throughout research. Just a lot of data convolution, understanding what data means. And there's nothing that you have to pick up before you get whatever job you want that you cannot learn on the job. And that's a key thing to remember, is that you do not need to have these skills before you're hired into a position. And this kind of, for me, comes right back down to luck and being confident in what you can do. And the thing that you can do is you can learn how to do most things. Nothing is really out of reach. Like one of the best skills that you learn in a PhD or a postdoc is that you're never going to have all of the skills that you can do to solve a certain problem, but you're really good at figuring out what they are and then learning how to do them, normally by yourself. So trust that and be confident with that, because most of the data scientist skills that I learned, like coding or machine learning, I learned very quickly on the job. And they'll have the resources to teach you that or provide that.
Thanks. Yeah, and I'd say besides learning, being able to learn quickly from having done a PhD, the other thing you learn is you also learn how to approach people and get help,
Yes,
and leverage other people's knowledge and skills to help to collaborate with them. Next question is, how can a PhD student start his or her journey as a part-time consultant?
I don't think this one's for me.
No, I was going to say, I think that sounds like one for me. So it's an interesting question, because it ties together a bunch of the other things we've heard about: getting to know people, doing some networking, targeting where you're interested in and why you might be interested in being there. I said I went into consulting and I didn't know what it was. I'm not sure I know the answer yet, by the way, really, in a satisfying way. But there are internship opportunities that are advertised on LinkedIn, on our websites. There are other opportunities that you can hook into just by talking with people and being introduced and finding your way in through probably a similar mechanism, but just a little bit sideways, because you don't quite fit the profile of the person who is supposed to be applying for a certain job. So you get put into a pool of people who come in that way. And that's kind of the way I came into it in the first place anyway, and landed a full-time job. But that's really in a very practical and tactical way. That's what it looks like. And
just focus a bit on the part-time aspect of that, because this question may be coming from someone thinking, I have a postdoc, I need to keep earning a living, and gradually transition towards a consultant role, and is part-time a way of doing that, right? Is any practical issues?
Yeah, so we have people who have actually started in roles and then finished MBA programs, for example, or finished other programs that they've been in. The MBA is one of the obvious ones that a lot of people will either start their consulting, start in a consulting role as they finish an MBA program. So one of the people who I'm a performance manager for is just finishing their MBA this month, I think, is when they finally finish sort of their final work in that one. So there are a lot of folks who will overlap in that way, and we've had a few people over the years who have come in sort of pseudo part-time roles, whether it be because they have a professional designation they're keeping up, which is useful to them. So I think people like pharmacists who need to actually work at a pharmacy as well to keep up their professional designation, they'll work on weekends and then be given some time on occasion during the week. I had somebody who was an X-ray tech, again, to keep up their designation, did work every so often, so some days they would end up working part-time weeks to work alternately. So there may be ways, and as Jennifer talks about, like the job posting is a wish list. That's kind of true. It's a checklist of things that you're hoping for, just in the same way that is not negotiable, but something that's worth asking about. It never hurts to ask. Never hurts to find somebody that you get to know and you ask them, is this possible? Would this work for you? And would we be able to make this work? Because I'm really excited about it. And I think it would work. So I'm dedicated. If you tell me you're dedicated at making it work, then I'm much more likely to try to find a way to make it work out for both of us.
Thank you.
This question, it can also, let me broaden it out if that's okay with you. It can also, so consulting can mean working at one of the big firms like KPMG, BCG, et cetera. But I'm also a consultant. I mean, if we sort of broaden out that term. And so part-time consulting, can just mean, depending on how the person meant it, taking a contract once in a while, doing freelance work. So I'm a freelancer, I'm a consultant, I'm a coach, I'm self-employed. It depends how you want to, what words you want to use. They're all sort of right. And I think networking is really, really huge here. There are lots of opportunities depending on your interests and skills in your network, what you want to do to come in for a short-term or part-time basis to help people make things happen. Or because consulting, I think basically is the organization or the person does not have the capacity right now to hire somebody full-time or ongoing. So they go to an external source and say, like, can we just hire you like very briefly so you can solve our problem for us? Right. And so PhDs, postdocs are often really awesome for this. Social scientists, I think particularly, to work on consulting contracts, it might be called, for government departments, for nonprofits, for individuals, for professors, right? You could help a professor write a grant, for example. You could do editing. There's so many different possibilities. You could tutor, right? Like you could also call that consulting. So I think network your way into those.
Thank you, Jen. I just want to follow up on a related question that's come up tangentially here and there. And Peter, this is for you on the MyTax. It sounded like the MyTax program, was it the Elevate program, I think you said, right? Played a significant role in transitioning for you, right? And there was a question about MyTax, and people may or may not be familiar with it, but the MyTax Elevate is a way of connecting someone in doing academic research with industry through a training program of a postdoc, typically. But how does someone who's finishing their PhD find a MyTax type position, right? How did you find it? Is it the professor finding you, or did you find the professor, or did you find the company? And now in hindsight, is it possible for someone to go out and find a company that may be interested in taking on a MyTax person and then finding a professor to work with on that? What are the sort of what are the opportunities there?
I think that's a great question. I know the program's evolved since I was in it. I was sort of in the guinea pig group in that first year. And if I recall just how my cohort kind of came to it, I mean, my experience was one where I was made aware of the program, and through the professor I was doing my postdoctoral work at the time, they actually were the ones who were affiliated with the initial company that I aligned to get my foot in the door. And it was then essentially through, and I'm bringing up this terrible word again, through networking with folks is the way you would explain it, is that just by talking with folks and finding out who was there, it was actually the company I ended up matched with for the majority of it was actually a company I was introduced to after I'd started the postdoctoral experience. And fortuitously, I was made aware of the program manager for that work needing to go on leave with his wife for a few years while she went off to do an academic posting in another country, and that they were looking for somebody who could really just pick up the reins immediately and run with it. And I was the person who was there. So after talking with me, I got pulled into that. And so there was a little bit of both sides of it. People hunting me down, me hunting them down as well. And that was similar to what I think a lot of folks had who were in my cohort for that program, where they saw it as an interesting opportunity. Some saw it as an opportunity to advance their academic career. Some saw it as an opportunity to align and completely jump ship into a company that they knew they wanted to work with and were already aligned with. And then it was through their immediate contacts who they then managed to find the links to whichever piece of that they were missing.
Thanks. As Jen mentioned, we do have a Mitex business officer, and that's Leslie Bone, and probably an idea to have a session with Mitex specific session in case there's interest for that. Last question I have that's submitted in advance is: any advice to a mature student who is re-entering the workforce in a field based on their academic experience and not the former area of work experience? So the way I'm reading this is someone did working in academia, went out to industry, and maybe wants to switch to a different industry based on the academic experience. And what advice would you give to this person?
Yeah, so my first thing I would say is assume that you are going to have a leg up versus folks who went straight through their degrees without having significant work experience outside of academia. Even though your work experience was in a quite different field from the one that you're moving into now, or that you are in now as an academic, that work experience in general is super, super valuable, and employers will recognize it. So I would definitely keep that in mind as you figure out what story you want to tell about the direction you're going into, because I see it as a very positive one. I had a really great career. I went back to school because I wanted to change my focus, and now I want to take all this awesome information, insights that I learned, and apply it directly in industry. And I bring with me a wealth of experience, a wealth of transferable skills, both from my years in graduate school as well as my past career. So I guess it's less advice and more like good.
Yeah. Thank you. Chelsea or Peter, anything to add?
Yeah, not so much advice, but more just, I think that's a great set of experience to have. Just coming across from academia, I would say I'm a bit of an anomaly. Most people have switched quite often between academia and industry. Most people who I'm working with in my team, they started off in industry as juniors, then they decided to go back and do a PhD, and then they transitioned again to industry, and then they went back and did a postdoc. And it's like this evolving career, right? Like you realize that there's so much more to be learned in a specific field. You go back and you have a project that's specifically for that. Then you realize that there's so much more that could be applied if you're in industry, if you do that. So it's quite organic, and they don't have to be necessarily related to each other, but it really seems like it's invaluable. I might just have to go back to academia now and do another stint and then come back.
Yeah, and I think speaking to my experience, I'm thinking of a particular individual who I worked with who started in engineering and, very much, mechanical or electrical engineering, so very focused space. Did their MBA specifically as part of their transition from where they were working before to where they wanted to be next, joined our digital health group, and is now working at another consulting company in digital health as well. And so managed to do a very active pivot in their career. And it's actually kind of what I've done all the way through, which was making sure that I was pivoting towards things that that I actually had a certain level of qualification behind me to do. So very much what you do in your training is not just important. I think it's critical to defining and helping you teach others what it is you're trying to do next. And the dedication to that retraining is actually also very important. And while acknowledging that history and the experience you bring to the table that others don't have.
Thanks, Peter. So just finishing off with a few questions that have come up in the chat. The first one, and this is a very specific one, so I'm not sure if anyone here knows of it, but Urvesh Kumar said they recently came to know about this scientific venture program called V1 Postdoc Fellowship in Entrepreneurship provided by the Quebec government along with Concordia University. Is there a similar program offered by the government of Ontario for postdocs? I'm not aware of anything. Urvesh Kumar, maybe you can connect with me, Haithem, and she can learn more about the program from you. And then see if there's something similar in Ontario. The next one is, you spoke about forums, how important is it to join them, and what should your agenda be once you're in the forums? Basically, how do you leverage being part of such a forum? I'm not sure who spoke about forums, but...
I think this might be related to the Cheeky Scientists Association that I had mentioned.
Probably.
So this has a fee, a membership fee. And it's high. It's high now. It wasn't so much when I joined.
Mm-hmm.
And what it is they provide materials such as like how to build your resume or your CV. But there are forums, like it's basically a glorified Facebook group. But I did find it, if only because it was a community of people that were going through similar transitions. And it provided some solidarity in that process that, for example, maybe my colleagues at the time or my friends at the time couldn't relate with. So it was just a source of additional resources, but also a way to gain information that I didn't really have access to through my community at the time. I'm not sure whether I would recommend it for the price that it is now, but you most likely will be able to find forums or groups that are very similar, even if it's on something as simple as Reddit. But there are communities everywhere if you look hard enough for them. And they provided very good support for me in particular. I can only speak to my own experience here, but that's my advice.
Thank you. Just I'll move on to the next question just to try and get through them. How do you overcome unseen barriers? For example, the university you graduated from plays a great role. How do you overcome such situations? So if you're graduating from a university, they may not have as high a reputation as other universities. Is that a barrier, and how do you try and overcome that?
No, because again, you're thinking like an academic. And we don't care what university you went to. And Peter's laughing. He doesn't care, right? It doesn't matter. What matters is your network. What matters is your skills. What matters is how you talk about yourself, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Yes, there are barriers. There is discrimination. There is sexism, racism, classism, et cetera, et cetera. Of course, all of that exists. But the name of your university is pretty irrelevant. Sorry, academics. But I mean, you know this too, right? Yeah, so don't it's one of those myths, right? That all of these things that folks coming out of academia think is true about the world beyond, and it's often not. Those are not what we care about. Is that helpful to hear?
I'd actually even take it a step further, because yeah, you're right, I was chuckling in the background there, because I also, when I started out and I said that my PhD wasn't an asset until I demonstrated myself to be one first, that was actually a bit of an understatement. Often I've said my PhD was potentially a liability before I demonstrated myself to be an asset first. And that's not because I did anything wrong in my PhD. It's because people had a sense of, oh no, this is going to be an academic who's going to be hard to talk to. He's going to use all sorts of jargon, not going to want to get along and work well with others. He's going to think he knows everything in the everything and knows more than everybody in the room. So there was actually a bias coming in. I will also admit that part of what academia teaches you to be is the smartest person in the room who stands at a podium and reminds everybody else in the room why you're the smartest person in the room. So that was something I had to get over in 5 minutes or less in order to last even more than a week in my current job. So I think that is the bigger part. We're coming back to this theme again, and of, be reflexive. Think about what are the strengths you are truly bringing to the table. Again, and also, like I've had to many times in my career, think about those things that are blocking you as well, potentially, that are maybe the biases for me that I'm bringing to the table, or those things, the assumptions I'm making about the way the world works, that I actually had to break down for myself so that it didn't get in my way as well. So I wouldn't worry as much about where your degree is from and more about, well, what have you done with it? And that's what I really want to hear, as Jennifer said.
So I've had to sort of describe this to potential graduate applicants till I'm blue in the face, and I don't know how many of them believe it, but even within academia, it doesn't matter too much. So I sit in a lot of search committees for faculty positions, and the last thing I'll look at on a CV is really the university did their PhD, and what I'm looking for is what do they do for their PhD? Does it fit what we're looking for? How productive have they been in terms of publications? Obviously, this is an academic position. And then in an interview, how well they can explain and describe what they did, answer questions about it, and how good their references are, right? The network in there.
So I just wanted to add,
yeah.
just to add to that quickly, because it is related, and even before inclusion and diversity and equity became such an important theme in everything that we do, and so overtly noted, in my own firm, when we go through our performance reviews and we do it openly, we've actually we used to have, when I started at the firm, headshots on slides that we showed for the accomplishments people had for the year. We removed those headshots from the slides. We actually also have bias challengers who are trained and brought into those meetings, who are peers and folks from leadership who come in specifically to identify whether or not they believe just to challenge people on whether or not there may be unconscious bias coming into the discussion of various sorts. And they have become, and over the last few years, we've become much, much better as a firm to speak to accomplishments without the advocating and flowery hyperbolic language that everyone is inclined to use when talking about people that they want to lift up. Speaking to people's accomplishments and not saying, this is a rock star who really deserves to be promoted, but actually saying, this is an individual who worked on 7 proposals this year, helped us do some solid work delivering large deliverables to X number of clients, and they've demonstrated clearly that they can both lead a team and manage the budget, so they should be promoted to a manager. Like, it's that kind of thing that we've done internally, and we try to do it also in our recruiting process as well. So, and I don't think we're alone in that. At all.
That's great. Good to hear. Thanks, Peter. So I think we'll start to wrap things up here. What I do want to say is that sort of networking and what that really means is an important aspect that has come out of this. And think of networking as connecting with fellow peers has been the most important network you can build. I think there's a lot of push to take advantage of May's services, and May has posted some links. So if you joined in late, Charlie will send a follow-up email to everyone who attended with all the links and information that we've shared in here, and May's just posted her email address as well. I do want to really thank Jen, Peter, and Chelsea for taking the time to come and talk to you here. I think, as you can see from all three of them, they're very passionate and fulfilled in the non-academic roles they've taken on. So I encourage everyone to sort of think about, really, in a very broad sense, what's going to be the most rewarding for you as a career, right? Not as the next job. Think long term. So thank you to the three of you for taking the time. And finally, I'd like to thank Charlie for putting this all together. She did a lot of work in advance for this. So thank you very much, Charlie, for putting this together. So there are some, Chelsea's happy to have anyone connect with her, and so we'll have contact information. I think we already put that in the posting, but in the follow-up information we sent. And I hope everyone has a great rest of the day. Take care.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.